Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
In this episode, Cameron gets a little praise and a little pushback for an argument that he made that Christianity is not making extraordinary claims when it says that there is a God. We look at some of the history and the mythology around the atheistic narratives and rebuttals to that, and then come back in for a more nuanced understanding of how we as Christians can handle that argument about whether or not Christians make extraordinary claims. This will be helpful for you as you try to understand the kind of the intellectual culture around Christianity and its engagement with a new type of atheism, and as you just seek to live more faithfully as a Christian. Like, share, subscribe, and if you want to see more about what we're up to or support our work, you can do so by visiting toltogether.com.
So I made some people happy and some people really angry online, which is really not saying much at all. That's pretty much an ordinary day on socials of any kind. But for a long time, Nathan, for years now, I have been arguing that against the popular notion that Christians shoulder the entire burden of proof when it comes to questions about the existence of God. Because, so the thinking goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary or demand extraordinary evidence. The claim that God exists is extraordinary. So Christians are on the hook to produce extraordinary evidence for God's existence. So I happen to believe that there is compelling evidence for God's existence. I know you do too, Nathan. We wouldn't be in the line of work that we're in if we didn't think that were the case. Nevertheless, I think this is a double standard, and it's a whole separate podcast. I don't even necessarily think it's true. I think there is compelling evidence for God's existence, and we can present it. I don't think you need to present compelling evidence for God's existence. Again, that's a separate question, but here's the thing. Skeptics of various stripes, and skeptics like to define themselves out of the conversation sometimes, I've found, so that they don't have to be on the hook for anything, but skeptics of various stripes who say this have fundamental commitments and assumptions of their own, some of which I think are extraordinary. Let me just name a few of them, and then I'll talk about why people got annoyed, and then love to hear you chime in, Nathan. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what this means for the future of our theological conversations with non-believers especially. But I said, so first of all, we live in a universe that is intelligible. Now that's extraordinary, and some of the greatest minds have noted that, Einstein and many others. So we live in a universe that is intelligible, it's comprehensible, it's governed by laws. We also have laws of logic that obtain for everyone, everywhere, and endure. I'm tempted to even say they're eternal. 1 plus 2 equals 3 would survive the total heat death of the universe. That's a very strange fact. We have human consciousness. So I'm not even touching on morality. I'm leaving morality out of this one. We don't have to go down that naughty trail. Just all of this alone, rational thinking and the hard sciences can't even get off the ground without all of that in place. So where does it come from? Are we supposed to just accept it as some sort of a brute fact? This is just the way things are? Well, that seems suspiciously like an extravagant claim to me. That somehow we have a comprehensible, intelligible universe. We have rational minds that can be trusted. We have laws of logic that obtain for everyone everywhere. Those just happen to all be in place. So I think those are extraordinary claims that all of that exists. So why isn't the skeptic also on the hook to produce some evidence for all of that?
Okay, I'll give you the answer to your question. So, and then I'll give the answer to our questions. The rationale, and I don't know what the flavors of the pushback you got are, is that yes, but if the universe didn't have all of those features, we wouldn't be here to discuss it. So of course it's extraordinary, but also of course it's brute fact, or we couldn't be surprised about it. That's the first level into this kind of anthropic principle pushback on it. I think it was Richard Swinburne who came up with this little I'm pretty sure it's Swinburne. He said, so imagine you're walking down the street, somebody, group of guys jump out of the van, kidnap you, pull you in the van, take you to a warehouse. They tie you to a chair, pull the hood off of you. They set 5 card shuffling machines in front of you, take out 5 brand new decks of cards, shuffle them once by hand, stick the 5 decks in the 5 card shuffling machines, and say, We're going to shuffle these cards, and if the top card is if all 5 top cards are, the ace of spades, we're gonna let you live, but if not, we're gonna shoot you. So, they push the buttons, and turns out all the first card that comes up on all of them is the ace of spades. And you go, "Whew, that's amazing." And
Just got lucky.
the naturalist well, just got so you could say, "Wow, that's amazing." And somebody could say, "No, you shouldn't be amazed, because if it hadn't turned out to be that way, you would have been shot in the head and you wouldn't have been there to be amazed."
Mhm. Yep.
And you
Yep.
just say, "Hey, hang on a second.
Yep.
No, the
Yep.
that's not quite that's that's not quite right here. You should still look at that and say the improbability of 5 decks of cards being randomly shuffled and all 5 having the same card on top and a predetermined same card on top makes me think that something was going on with the system, or somebody monkeyed with it. My surprise is not invalid." And I think that is a helpful little framing device here,
Mhm.
Cameron, to
For sure.
say the normal argument is saying, like, "No, it just of course it happens that way, or you wouldn't be here." But you're saying, "No, the vast majority of humans have recognized the improbability of all of this and have concluded that there is something else afoot or
Mhm.
something else at play here beside random time and chance." I think
Mhm.
does that first of all, do you think I sufficiently explained that analogy as it relates to your question, and then pick it up and go with it?
Yes. Well, I think that shows that just appealing to, well, it had to be this way. Sheer necessity means that it had to be this way in order for us to even raise the question. I think what the Swinburne example shows is that that is at best an evasion. The issue still remains, yeah, but it's fair to ask, in other words, yeah, but why is it this way? You can say it's a brute fact. You can say it's necessary for us to even raise the question. Okay, it is necessary for us to raise the question. Yes, we need breath in our lungs. We need existence to be able to have this conversation. It's still fair for the Christian or the religious person to say, yeah, but why would it be so? Why this arrangement? Now,
Yeah, we
some
agree that it is.
right,
That's not
that's not in
incontrovertible.
dispute. A couple of responses that I think are worth considering here. One is that, all right, we don't have an explanation for, say, human consciousness yet, dot, 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 but we will. If you would just believe in science, you'll see that these are items that demand further exploration rather than shutting them
Ah,
down right at
Cameron,
Mhm,
Cameron,
mhm.
Cameron, you used belief and science together.
I did, and by the way,
So so
I'm
but
giving you
this
a
but
direct
this is the
that is a
issue.
quote that's a quote, by the way. That's not me. That's a direct quote of one of the responses I got, "If I would just believe in
Yeah,
science." Mhm.
well, but that is your point, is it not? That you're
Oh,
making a
absolutely.
philosophical, theological claim, whether or not you
Yes.
say, "I believe in God," or "I believe in science," which, by the way, nobody that I know thinks those are mutually exclusive categories. So, but to believe in something is to say that I have confidence that this process will result in a deeper description of my understanding of reality, is a pursuit of clarifying the how without giving any why. So it doesn't matter how well you describe it. That's not fundamentally the category that we're seeking as humans. I mean, nice to
So,
know, but
so 2 responses to that, that particular claim, "If I just believe in science." So one day we'll get there, and we'll possibly even reach consensus on these issues. Let's say that we do
that's
have
God of the gaps.
right.
That's science of the gaps.
Science of the gaps. Let's say that you do have one day, I don't think this will happen, but let's say one day, in theory, you do get an exhaustive explanation of the mechanics of human consciousness, how it works. Even if we had that, and I think there's very good reason to doubt that we'll ever have anything like that because consciousness is such a marvel and so much more rich than we even can wrap our minds around. But if maybe we could, if we do, That still wouldn't explain consciousness away. It would explain how it works. So think about the the scene in I think it's I think it's Prince Caspian, where they and the name his name's gonna escape me now. They meet a being who was formerly an actual star in the heavens. And Eustace, Clarence Scrub, says to him, "Oh, well, in our world, stars are just big swirling balls of gas." And he says, "That in even in this world, that's what we're made of, but that's not what we actually are." So if you offered some kind of a full mechanical explanation of how consciousness works, it wouldn't explain consciousness away. Where did it come from? How did it come about in the first
Yeah,
place? You still have that, but also the other bigger issue that I was raising that in these conversations seems to be completely lost on non-believing interlocutors is that all you have to assume everything I just named earlier in order for science to even get off the ground. So the fact that the wonder that science actually works, that we can actually make contact with reality, to use Michael Polanyi's phrase, that itself that's not self-evident. Ancient peoples didn't believe that. Ancient peoples didn't have sophisticated scientific enterprises because they didn't think the universe could be known in that way. They thought it was inscrutable, largely chaotic. This is so anyway, there's a little history in here
yeah.
as well, but
Well,
I'll pause there.
let me make this really complicated and as perhaps a total distraction, or maybe it'll be illustrative. Um, so let me preface this by saying that I don't think this works like this. One of the nice little quips of a way to think of this. I think when I was a kid one time, my grandpa said, um, the reason that you can't see a mind under a microscope is the same reason you can't see God through a telescope. Um,
Yeah.
and that plays in here a little bit, I think, is talking about consciousness and the divine. But if you if you were to take the just believe in science
Mhm.
in the way that that's being made, what would people say, Cameron, if you posted, "I believe that one day science will help us build a telescope so good that we can see God."
Sure.
That that so, no, I don't think that's
Mm.
gonna happen because I it's categorically distinctive. But what if we start using "I believe science will"
Mhm.
in order to talk about clearly metaphysical things? People would be like, "Oh, that's ridiculous. It doesn't work like that." Yeah, but that is the way that you're using the word science, is
Yes.
to say that it has some metaphysical explanatory power.
Mhm. And so that brings me to another objection that's often brought here is, well, why don't you so it's not just believe in science, but why don't you like science? Why are you arguing against science? Science is our friend, it helps us learn. To which I want to respond, where in any of what I just said did you hear a disparagement of the hard sciences? I think the hard sciences are marvelous. I think they grant us absolutely breathtaking insights. And I think they answer a lot of really profound questions. The only thing I'm suggesting is that they don't constitute, or ought not at least to constitute, an entire worldview, because that's not what they were
Sure,
meant to be.
yeah.
That's beyond their explanatory scope. But that's not a in no way is that a disparagement of the hard sciences. In fact, part of why they work so well is because of how narrow their focus is. That's what makes them so effective and such a powerful tool. But when we try to turn them into a substitute religion or a full worldview, then we run into these kinds of confusions that we're naming. But in no way are Nathan or I disparaging science in any of this. But that's something that I
Mm.
hear often when I
Every
bring this
once in a
up.
while
Hmm.
Cameron, it does come in handy to mention if you have an undergraduate degree in physics, you know?
Yes.
It's it's like Nathan hates science so much. The
Yes.
um,
To bring
the
that that's a
so
rather salient
let's
fact here.
just slide that one in there. And by yeah, well, anyway, we won't go down that route. Anyway, there's another side to this, Cameron, which is, and I think this is where, Charles Taylor, I think he's still in the water. He kind of had his moment, but
Oh,
still so
he just
helpful
brought
to
out a new book,
recognize.
by the way. So if the guy is
Oh,
like 600 pages,
still
the
cranking it
dude
out, huh?
oh, he's cranking them out. Yeah, absolutely. Still going strong.
Ch- Chuck Taylor, not to be confused with the shoes from the 80s. Um, the I'm glad you got that. Here one of his points, and this is in The Secular Age, or you can get it in James K. Smith, How Not to Be Secular. The point of it is that I think we're living in a moment in which the the pushback has been on this conversation toward religious belief of, look, we used to believe this, that you needed Thor to have, or Zeus to have thunder, or Thor throws his hammer, like, like the whole mythology explained how the world worked, and we have systematically, through the scientific process, eliminated the need for there to be a god of grain and river nymphs and the whole thing all the way down. And so we've systematically demythologized the world through the scientific process, and that has brought us to the point where there are a couple weird hang-ons who, cling to one more god, one last god, but by and large, the rest of us can knock that one off the pedestal also and move on. And science will have done that and fulfilled our lives and brought us a deep explanation of the way that the world works. And what Charles Taylor is saying is that story that is told as a story of subtraction, one god less, one god less, one god less, is a modern mythology in and of itself, and that it is not a subtraction story that has actually happened. The subtraction story is the mythology. What has actually happened is it is the first time in human history that we have been, um, I don't know, arrogant enough, secure enough, materialistically blessed enough to tell ourselves a story where we have constructed a mindset in which it is possible to think that we could build meaning in our lives without
Mhm.
external reference. And so
Yeah.
I think that's just a very important observation, is to recognize that the mythology of subtraction, that the story of subtraction of the gods, which I scientifically think is helpful to the way that we got rid of some bloodletting and leeches and medieval dentistry.
Elixirs.
Sweet,
I don't want an
like
elixir. Don't
that's
drink
great.
mercury, please. Don't
I
do it.
wait. I don't waste that much time on alchemy anymore. The
We did
that
drink
we
bleach during COVID, I guess, but yikes. We're getting there slowly.
other than that, um, to recognize that we're living in a secular moment that is the weird phase historically where we think we can construct and justify our own existence and our own meaning, and that this is the new feature. And so the people who are arguing against Cameron, the stupidity of the assumption that it's an extraordinary claim to believe they're a god, don't yet recognize that they themselves are encapsulated in a mythological bubble that has existed in a very tiny time in human history, and it is now, and that's the platform that they're arguing from. And so I
Yeah.
think Taylor is right to point that out, but it does put the Christian back into the category of saying game on. Now, before you comment on this, let me be sympathetic to say, from Romans argues it's obvious there's a God. The entire work of Scripture of the Christian Bible doesn't make an attempt to prove the existence of God. It's assumed to be something that is known, is evident. It's trying to answer the question, what is God like? That there is a human history of the vast majority of humans engaging in a spiritual realm, even while recognizing physical nature and the physical world and appreciating science. Um, that doesn't mean that it's a slam dunk, that just because it's intelligible to think that there's something more going on, ta-da, therefore the resurrection of Jesus and he loves you. But Cameron didn't say that at the beginning. He was just saying that it's an extraordinary claim. I think either way, to say the universe came from nothing or that God created the universe, both of those are extraordinary claims. I'm comfortable with that. But I
Yes.
think what Cameron is trying to poke at is that they're equally extraordinary claims. And so you can't just pull one out of those out of thin air and then act like you don't have to engage with the conversation on the other side, of which I don't see as a categorical distinction really. But we can't separate them out in a nice and neat, tidy way and then act like, just be totally dismissive toward
Mhm.
um, theological or religious belief, um, and count that as a valid argument.
Two things, which will likely annoy some people. First, just to go along with what you said about the the created order, as we would call it as Christians, or just the majesty of the natural world. I've heard Alex O'Connor use that phrase before. People down the ages and up to the present, the vast majority of people have taken it as obvious that there's something more going on. There's more to life than meets the eye. and there's probably a larger power, a god or gods behind it all. To my mind, that's an obvious conclusion to draw, and people do draw it and have drawn it down the ages, and I think that you have to be educated out of it, and I think
Mhm.
plenty of people are educated out of it because the prevailing
Or
ecosystem
distracted out of it, Cameron.
or absolutely, and Charles Taylor, once again, is really good on that. Just think about he points out in A Secular Age and actually various places that no matter where you look, unless you're way out isolated camping or in the country or on some kind of a mission trip or something like that, your view is probably circumscribed by technology and human ingenuity. Cars, buildings, power lines, airplanes in the sky, satellites competing with the stars, which tends to it's not all bad, but it tends to mislead us into thinking that we're the ones in control and that this is our world with all the stuff we've made. This was not the view of ancient people, by the way, when they looked into the heavens and they saw the blazing stars and they saw the created order around them. They drew the opposite conclusion. Wow, there's so much here. There's such majesty and order and arrangement, beauty and intricacy to it. And this wasn't lazy thinking. It was just a very reasonable assumption that, well, this didn't all get here on accident. It can't have all gotten here on accident. Yeah, the deck shufflers didn't all just randomly come up with an ace. There's somebody behind
So,
this.
but here's the let me push into this a little bit more because some of it is like we do want there to be a significance to our lives. We do want there to be a way to justify our own activities and actions, and the stories of the ancients and the mythologies that they constructed, you could say that was a nice placebo to help them maintain a sense of agency and duty and responsibility or certain behaviors that were incentivized by the propagation of these mythologies. And Cameron are not saying that religion hasn't been weaponized for the control of people, for telling stories to incentivize people to do certain things. Like, yes, that
Oh, we believe human
agreed.
beings are
That
sinners and fallen. So, yeah, if
yeah.
that's our
So
anthropology, yeah, anything can be misused.
so
Yeah.
we're happy to throw the yellow flag on the play of a lot of what has happened in the past. However, that does not mean that the opposite then, which is to say that because I can, by my own mental fortitude, find a way to live in this bleak universe on a pale blue dot and still have happiness in my life without religious symbolism or participation, that therefore that makes me a more rigorous or intellectually astute or more right observer of reality. And that's that goes back to
Yep.
the whole thing of like, who was it that told Dawkins that Christianity is, just for those who are afraid of the dark. And
Mhm.
then Lennox says, and atheism is for those who are afraid of the light.
Yep.
But I mean, so is, but that idea, I think there's a little bit of a, dare I say, it, uh, self-congratulatory posture in some of this pushback to what you're probably running into here, Cameron, is saying, I am the type of being that doesn't need these stories in order to live. And
You
Taylor is saying that
yes,
works almost,
almost.
almost. So
So this
technology can almost get you there.
well, yeah, so the second thing I was gonna say, the first is that you gotta be educated out of the very basic assumption that there's something more behind life and all that exists. And the second is that if you do say that, "Oh, I don't need those stories to console me. I'm fearless before this empty universe," you're also on borrowed credit, though. The hard sciences flourished
Un
under the patronage of the church, and any responsible historian of science will tell you look at Edward Grant, for instance. I'd recommend his book on the middle science in the Middle Ages, and you can see its deep entanglement in Christian theology. But the the reason there, I mean, that doesn't mean you have to buy into it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It means part of the intellectual heritage of the sciences is a vision of a created universe with an order and an arrangement and human beings who are made for a specific reason and whose lives have real meaning and significance. This was part of the huge shock to the system that was Charles Darwin's, you know, The Descent of Man and The Origin of the Species. I don't have the full title at my disposal here because it seemed to knock man or humanity off its special throne as, being made in the image of God and all of that. But even so,
why?
Yeah.
Well, why, Cameron, were the older thinkers better at seeing the logical conclusions of this? So Nietzsche goes nuts recognizing that at the moment that you inhabit this mindset, that all justice or external standards fly out the window and it's all about power.
Yeah.
And why could he so quickly get there where
Yeah.
now seems like we kind of live in this,
It's a great question. This is
like that
gonna
would be the logical conclusion of this. And I
yeah,
think Nietzsche was a good thinker. Like
he
he saw
was.
where this was going. And now it's kind of like, well, I can have my cake and eat it too in
Nietzsche
my dismissal of the foundational things that hold us together.
well, first of all, because Nietzsche was actually a very deeply Christian thinker. I'm not saying he was a Christian, but you can't have the kind of vitriolic hatred that Nietzsche had without knowing deeply. And I remember this Nietzsche is the son of a Lutheran minister. And but you're right, this is part of
He probably had
year
some catechisms in him.
oh, yeah. Well, and years ago, David Bentley Hart, I think I mentioned this, lamented the fact that we're dealing with such superficial atheists these days. And what he had in mind was an atheist of the stature of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche had a profound, two of the most profound screeds against Christianity are probably Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, which, by the way, incidentally, I don't know what David Bentley Hart believes was written in a fever of almost demonic possession, demonic inspiration,
There
because
you go.
he penned that book very, very quickly, and it's truly an infernal philosophy in that book. It's very powerful, very forceful. And the other one, though, is Ivan Karamazov from the Brothers Karamazov in his Rebellion chapter, where he brings probably the most forceful argument against God on the basis of evil that you'll ever encounter. I mean, it was so devastating that critics still will maintain Dostoevsky.
My 12-year-old daughter read that a month or 2 ago. That's good
Yeah, so
bedtime
critics
sleeping.
will say, "Hey, yeah, well, he's never gonna recover the rest of the book, he can't recover from that," and I think the rest of the book is meant to be a holistic answer to it. But both of those were profoundly Christian in the sense that they grasped the moral vision of Christianity in the heart of it. So Nietzsche understood that if God is indeed dead, like, even just culturally speaking, if God's dead, if we've rejected God, then all of the institutions that we cherish, all of our moral sensibilities, I mean, again, Tom Holland's helping us remember this now, but all of those will eventually wither and die on the vine because that's where they all came from. So what's needed, according to Nietzsche, is a transvaluation of all values. You have to reconceive everything. And what Nietzsche really wanted was a return to a kind of romanticized pagan vision that he had. That's where he's weaker as a thinker, by the way, because his view of paganism is a bit. It's not a bit. It's romanticized. But that's where Tom Holland is helpful again in doing us the courtesy of showing, hey, the wellspring of the Western institutions and the values you so cherish, secular and Christian alike, is the church. It's Christianity. When you lose that, you're going to find that all of these things, including the hard sciences that you love, are going to die. And that's not, I mean, think about even some of the really, really kind of acidic forms of critical theory or postmodernist theory that take aim even at objective standards or at the hard sciences because these are colonized disciplines that have, perpetuated injustices. And it's not hard to, look into the history of science and see, people who are eugenicists, for instance, and find horrible skeletons in the closet. Once again, as Christians, we would say, yeah, because human beings are fallen and sinners and anything can be abused. But if you
So can
yeah. So I opened all these cans of
can
worms, but yeah.
well, can I take that and run this around to a challenge on the other direction? Because we don't wanna sit here and be like, "All those silly people who don't," I don't think we wanna have that dismissive tone. And perhaps I'm convicted by the question I asked you, which was like, why did Nietzsche see the logical outworkings of this, and the rest of us can't? Is it in Thomas Hardy's Middlemarch? There's that scene where there's a farmer who has the sheepdog, and the sheepdog is meant to help herd and move the sheep. And then one night, the sheepdog goes out and gets too excited and chases all the sheep, and they run off a cliff and kills them all. And then I
Such a
think he
Tom
shoots the
Hardy
dog.
scene.
Yeah, but there's a line in there right after that, about the dog reaching the logical conclusion, of which like philosophers haven't yet. Of saying, are there like so the dog chasing the sheep and then chasing the sheep off the cliff and then everything dying is the logical outwork of that set of conditions. And so he's using that as an illustration or a literary reference to this idea of there are ideas that when we run them to their literal conclusion lead to death and destruction and
Yeah,
despair.
they're
And so
self-destructive, yeah.
Nietzsche saw that. Yeah, they're self-destructive. And then I asked you the question, well, why can't we in a modern time see that? But here's a different way of looking at that to challenge the believer of why are we not willing to run the logical conclusion of the things that we believe as Christians all the way out to their extreme end?
Hmm.
And so it's one thing to say, and hey, I'm thrilled that there are people who don't run their self-destructive nihilistic ideas to their logical conclusion. That's great.
Amen.
I'm happy to live in a culture that can stabilize and feed those people and care for them when they're in the nursing home when they get older. That's great. Um, but if we're if what we're really wrestling with here, Cameron, is like how do we live with an intellectual consistency and base our lives like actually and behaviorally off of what it is that we say we believe to be true. I think we're also seeing a massive shortage of modern Christians embracing the radical nature of what Jesus says when he says, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all the rest of these things will be added. Um, I
Yeah.
live with broken priorities on a daily basis. That's why I have
Yeah,
to
me too. Yeah.
routinely throughout the day try to realign myself with this is what I'm this is what I know to be true, and this is what I say I believe. How then do I reorient and shed the distractions and the shallow thinking and the technological um, temptations to lean back into doing this? So I think anytime that I see somebody living out an idea inconsistently, I can find the elements and the workings of that in my own life and use that as a conviction and a challenge for my own spiritual growth and development in the way that I live in my household, in my family, in my neighborhood, in my church, in my community, county, country, and world. Um, so let's never, as Christians, get into this chest beating or looking down our nose at the person beating their chest. Um, of a no one should think more highly of themselves than they ought, but rather with sober judgment and according with the measure of grace God has given us. Um, let's walk out of this conversation in that posture, I think, of saying, Lord, would you help me be faithful in living this well? And then I think responding with clarity and kindness to the people who might think that, orienting your life around something other than yourself is an extraordinary claim, is to say it is an extraordinary claim, but it's not an extraordinary claim in order to be a confrontation. It's an extraordinary claim in order to be an invitation. And I think that's where we can put the Christ-like spin on the false conflict that is there, is that to do this in a tone and a posture that says, dream a little bigger, come in a little farther, see the bigger picture, see a more beautiful story. And actually, I think you'll find that as you pursue things scientifically, it will point in this direction, not the other. That's a pretty fun spot to live and operate from. And I think it pleases the Lord when we do so. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.